Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast. Today, we are learning how to create meaningful work for the world to enjoy. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast, a weekly podcast for those who believe that moments matter most and that a beautiful photo is more than just a sum of its settings. A show for those who want to do more with the gear they have to take better photos today. And now, your host, Raymond Hatfield.
Welcome back to the first interview of the new year. I'll tell you what, I'm ready for it. You heard me talk all throughout December about how I like to slow down and do some, real long-term planning for the year ahead. Well, it's time to put all that planning into action. It's time to start doing stuff. Time to make do, right? So whether your plan is to either, learn photography, you can do that by joining the free Facebook group where I'm sharing an educational photography tip and trick video every Monday. Or if your plan is to make 2021 the year that you start charging for your work and making money with your camera, it's time to get to work. Now, for premium members, I have something really special for you that I'm excited to share, and that is that next week we are kicking off our featured expert series where I'm bringing in experts to help you dive deeper into a specific topic that you need help with that is going to better prepare you for turning your dream of becoming a full-time photographer into reality. So next week, I'll be hosting Andrea, who is the lawyer behind the contract vault, and she's going to be answering all of your legal questions pertaining to photography and giving you a lesson in how to get set up legally and protect yourself from any potential litigation. Now, these featured expert series trainings are included in your premium membership. You already get it. So if you are not yet a premium member and you want to join the legal setup training with Andrea, then you can become a premium member today by heading over to beginnerphotographypodcast.com and click that premium membership button at the top of the page. Now, this week, I'm so excited for this, 4-time return guest and listener favorite, Marc Silber. So Marc has been shooting more than 40 years. He's authored some of my favorite photography books, as you're going to hear in the interview, and also hosts his YouTube channel called Advancing Your Photography. This interview full of knowledge and great stories that I know you're going to love. Let's do it. Marc, you recently actually just embarked on a bit of a journey to connect with budding photographers. I want to know, what were you hoping to learn from these conversations that you had?
Yeah, I really wanted to make sure I was connected to my audience because you can assume things, but maybe they're not really what people are after.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a number of things. I started, some surveys, but then I went took a much deeper look, and I actually called up my audience. I called up members of my audience. I put out a notice, hey, I'd like to talk to you on the phone. If you, have 15 minutes, would you be willing to, get on the phone with me? And most of them were really surprised. Many of them are my book readers. Now, I don't know how many authors do that, where they call up their readers of their books. But
I would assume not too many. Yeah.
Not very many. People were very surprised. And I took careful notes, and I basically sifted through all this information because, again, I want to know. I'm, as an author, running a YouTube channel, I don't want it to be a one-way flow of just me putting out data. I need to know what's happening at the other end.
Mm-hmm.
And if things are resonating or not resonating, and what is resonating. So I kind of sifted it down to 5 things. I mean, there's many other things, but these floated way to the top. These were the big points that people were struggling with, or their desires, and what they really had as an ultimate goal. And I found this really fascinating because it helped me not only understand my audience, but be able to shape what I'm talking about, to really align with these things. Also, it's kind of, well, I was just going to say one other thing. It's actually really fun. We all like getting feedback, whether it's people looking at your photographs or a video you made or whatever. It's always interesting to get feedback, I think. So there's that too.
So when you made these phone calls, when you put out these surveys, what did you already have like a list of questions that you wanted to ask? And I guess what was the purpose of these questions? Or
Yeah,
what
I
were some of the
did
questions?
some of the questions. Yeah, so I did ask them. So, obviously I want to know what level they were as a photographer. What they were struggling with was one of my questions. What areas challenge you the most, which I'll talk about. I know the answer to that. But also what their goals were. And I found it fascinating where the challenges varied a lot, but the goals were very similar person to person. And I I found that really interesting. And it resonated for me because they're my goals too.
Mm-hmm.
So
Oh,
when we get to that, I'll reveal what that is. I mean, it's pretty
yeah,
interesting.
gotta stay tuned. Yeah. So
Yeah.
when we talk about these different challenges that were different from person to person, but these goals were the same, what sorts of challenges were these photographers facing? And I guess even a step further back is you said that you wanted to know where they're at and what level
Yeah.
they're at. So what level were these photographers who you were talking to at?
Um, Either beginner or intermediate.
Mm-hmm.
I did talk to a few who were at the pro level. Of course, that's a very different audience.
Of course.
However, I will say the goals were the same.
Mm-hmm.
This is a, this was really fascinating. The pros, what they were struggling with was almost nothing in terms of technique, camera function, that sort of thing. They there actually were a couple of common answers to the beginners even, and I'll go over that. But their goals were absolutely uniform, whether it was beginner, intermediate, or advanced. They all had very similar goals at the end of the day.
So
And
what sorts
I'll
of
be curious if
challenges? Go
the
on.
biggest challenges. Okay, so the biggest challenges were number one, being creative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'll talk about that, and getting inspired. So that's kind of like creativity slash inspiration and learning composition. And those things actually fit together. So if you think about it, like we can all have great gear. We can even know, lighting and we know some compositional techniques and that sort of thing. But if you're not inspired,
Mm-hmm.
your camera is going to sit on the shelf,
Yeah, of course. Of course.
right? Or and I'm guilty of this, we end up taking the same photograph over and over again. Maybe because it gets a lot of likes. You put it on Instagram. Hey, sunsets. Okay, we know warm light sunsets. You get a lot of likes. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just because it pops out of the camera. Okay, when
Mm-hmm.
you're looking, or the iPhone, and so that's fine. But if you just keep doing the same photograph over and over again, are you really progressing anywhere? Are you getting anywhere? Probably
Ah,
not.
that's an interesting question. That's an interesting question because I think, like, in almost all other professions, the more that you do the same thing, I guess the better that you get at it. But with photography, there is that weird creative element to it, to where if you do the same thing over and over again, it loses its magic, I guess, that kind
Exactly.
of draws you in to kind of go forward. So were you finding that that was the issue when it came to inspiration for many, is that they were doing the same thing over and over again, or they were too overwhelmed?
Yeah, well, I think they lacked a technique for getting inspired, and there is a
Mm.
technique for that.
Right. And it's all in your book, Create, right
It
here, which is
is.
one of my favorite books of all time. It's
Thank
definitely
you.
the book that I give away most is to other listeners of the podcast and whatnot, is as you've broken it down so clearly. So I guess before we move forward, you want to talk about kind of the creative process?
Yeah. So, and it actually started with my book earlier in that, Advancing Your Photography.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when I wrote Create, I took a lot of the principles that applied only to photography, and I spanned it out so you could apply it to any creative field, but they fit together. Because whereas Advancing Your Photography talks about the whole process of photography, including inspiration, Create is really, just on that one subject. But here's a good example, Raymond. So we all have to look somewhere to get inspired.
Hmm.
If it's not from our own experiences, we look out, we look out to get inspired. And it is part of the creative process of looking for inspiration. So I interviewed a photographer many years ago. His name is Joseph Holmes, fantastic landscape photographer, a very sort of conservative looking fellow. His landscapes were impeccable and they're beautiful. And I asked him what his inspiration was. And he said, the Beatles. This really, what? What do you mean the Beatles? How does a rock and roll group inspire a landscape photographer? You might think more like Debussy or Mozart or, obviously a classical musician, but not the Beatles. And he said, no, actually, the Beatles inspired him because he went to one of their concerts and he saw so much energy coming out of them that somehow it just fueled his own photography.
Wow.
And using the Beatles as an example, and I hope this doesn't label me as incredibly old school, but one of the things about the Beatles, and we were talking about repeating yourself over and over again, they literally never repeated themselves. Mm-hmm. Every album was a reinvention of their music, which I think is one of the things that made them such a phenomenal group. Whereas, and I'm not going to name names, but I have heard some musicians where I could pick up album 1 and album 8, and there's not much difference.
Sure, yeah.
There's different songs, but the music itself sounds pretty much the same. And it's not a bad thing. They're just kind of carrying on through a process. But I think it's also really important to get inspired and go out and try new things. And we can find that inspiration from watching a movie. My favorite thing is looking at art itself, looking at art books. Better to go to a museum and look at it on the wall. But if you can't do that right now, go grab some books and look at how those photographs were made, or that piece of art, a painting or whatever. And that's kind of what fuels that inspiration.
When it comes to, that example of music where, with the Beatles, each album was entirely different, and other artists, there's not so much variation there. For photographers, like, that's kind of a scary thing to be able to look at those first photos and then, say, years later, look at your photos and realize that you really haven't come that far, right? What do you think that comes down to? Is that just technical ability, or is that something else?
It's a combination. And, in the book Create, actually in Advancing Your Photography, my first book, I talk about the 5 stages of photography. Mm-hmm. And those all they fit together, right? So it's not just a random process of learning photography. There are 5 stages you go through. First is visualizing, which means you get an idea, rather than just, Ansel Adams made the distinction, when you just press the shutter, you're taking snapshots. But when you visualize it first, when you get an idea in your mind before you press the shutter, then it has a chance of being a work of art. And it's not to say you can't do that really fast, like Henri Cartier-Bresson is capturing the moment, but he visualized those photographs. He knew that if he stood in this location, he would come away with that, some kind of image that he wanted. So first you visualize, then you do have to know your equipment, because if you don't know your equipment, we were talking about this before we, started the show. If you're constantly changing your gear around or relearning or whatever, you're throwing variables into the mix. Mm-hmm. And that just slows you down, and it means you're going to miss photographs. Photographs could only be there for a second.
Right.
And if you're like, I don't remember where the ISO is on this camera and it's too high or too low or whatever, by the time you get through fumbling with it, the photograph is gone. That's why I think we all love our iPhones, because there's nothing to fumble with here.
Right.
It's unless it's just you're slow in opening it, but you can just get out there and, boom, there it is, instantaneous. But you got to know your gear. You got to know how to process your image. I mean, even from the iPhone, I never just publish something without I'm going to tinker with it. I'm going to do
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
And then there, then you get into, I'm sorry, I actually missed a step there. It's capturing. Once you know your equipment, you have to capture it. And capturing is basically lighting and composition. What you do with your camera, lighting. I mean, there's three things that you're going to deal with: timing, lighting, and composition. No matter what kind of photograph you're creating, it's the timing of the shot, the composition of it, and the lighting. That's it. And then you edit it, and then the final stage is getting your work out to the world. And that's all the creative process. You have to have all five of those things in place to really fulfill your creative desires and your goals. Super important. And where any one of those is missing or it's not quite dialed in for you, then the whole process kind of, will bog down at that point.
Slow down,
So
yeah.
just to answer why do people not progress is because one of those five things is not in place. It's that simple.
So let's go back to the whole visualization thing there real quick.
Yeah.
I kind of want to talk a little bit more about that because, as you said, this is one of the most important aspects of it because this is where you get an idea of what that picture is, and then it pushes you to be able to go after it and get it, something that maybe you've never done before.
Yeah.
Where do you think most people get the visualization aspect wrong or stop growing?
Well, let me give you an example from just the other day. So Hasselblad sent me a camera, 907, that I'm testing out, and it came with two lenses. One was a 40 millimeter, which is basically a really pretty wide lens for that camera. The other is a 90 millimeter, which is just slightly, longer than the normal lens. And I decided I was going to go out, speaking of sunset, take some photographs at sunset. I live in a very beautiful place, and I went over by the ocean. And so I had to move around to I kept finding, and these were not very inspired photographs. I mean, the sun is going down into the ocean. Okay, I've taken a million of those shots. So then I was up kind of on the edge of, it wasn't a cliff, but you could walk down and get to a much lower vantage point. And I found the lower vantage point I got, it became more interesting. And then I noticed that what I was getting was I was seeing the waves smashing. Sorry.
Oh, no worries.
No, put it on. I saw the waves crashing against the rock and coming over the sun. In fact, I included this photograph in my batch of photos for you, so you might want to.
It'll be in the show notes.
Yeah. All of a sudden, that became a really interesting photograph. Now, I look back after I spent about 15 minutes just, because I didn't know the timing if I had it right. And I finally got one where the wave was just boom and the sun was going down. It was like, wow, that's the money shot. That's what I thought in my mind. Then I look back where I had been. There's a whole row of people up there, 25 feet higher than me, with their iPhones.
Yeah.
And none of them were able to get that image. So to answer your question, the visualization came in once I saw, what would it be like if I went down there?
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm going to have a totally different picture than standing up on the road with everybody else. And I didn't even realize there were all those people up there until because I had been so engrossed in what I was doing that I was paying attention to what was going on in this direction, not what was going on back there. So visualization is often looking at something from a different point of view, literally, right? And that could be changing your angle. Like if we're used to walking around and shooting everything from eye level,
it's going to be pretty boring.
It can get really boring. But what happens if you kneel down or you get on a ladder, you get really high, or you even tilt your camera a little bit, and you put an angle on it. All of a sudden, these things start to change how your photograph is going to look. And it's like cooking. If you don't ever put any spices in what you're cooking,
Gonna be
it could be
boring.
pretty bland.
Yeah. That's a perfect case for oatmeal. Oatmeal by itself is disgusting. It's very boring. You put in
Yeah.
some honey, a little bit of brown sugar, some cinnamon. It's
Cinnamon,
delicious. Yeah.
yeah, maybe even chili
Raisins.
powder.
Ooh, yeah.
Right? Just a tiny bit, right?
Mm,
And that's how these amazing chefs come out with something remarkable, because all of a sudden they try something that nobody else has ever done before.
right, right. There's this interesting concept. I don't remember where I heard it. I don't remember if I read it. I don't remember if I saw it in a video. But whatever it was, it stuck with me pretty well. The idea of this, and it was talking about becoming a better photographer and how
Yeah.
sometimes you just have to take the boring photos to be able to get something very unique. And I remember
Yeah.
back to when I was just starting to learn how to shoot on film, right? And I had actually, it's over there, my dad's old Pentax K1000, and I went out and I was really excited to get something new and fresh, and this whole world of film was very exciting. And right away, I didn't know what to do. I was kind of fumbling with these ideas. And I remember that, once again, sometimes you have to take the boring photos. And it was this beautiful field of, I don't know, daisies, wildflowers, whatever it was. And I just stopped and I took the boring photo, right?
Yeah.
And I think that slowed me down enough to think to myself, all right, I got that. Now what could I do? And then I think I just like rotated the camera into a portrait orientation, and then I took it, played with the composition a little bit. But then by the end of that roll, like photo number 36 is one of my favorite photos because it's a single flower. The entire background is just green, and it was after the sun had gone down. It's just this beautiful photo, and I love it very much. And I don't think that I would have got it if I hadn't taken that boring photo first. So whenever I think about visualization, I struggle with this because I don't think that I could have visualized that photo before I had went out there and
Yeah.
kind of discovered it. And then you telling that story right there kind of is very similar. You went out there thinking that you were going to get the sunset shot, but then it developed over
It
time. So
developed into something. Yeah.
yeah, how much of this is I guess, is this luck that you get out and you find this and then you explore it, or is this just being open-minded? Does that question
Well,
make sense?
no, that's a really good question. And here's the thing about visualization: it can be very broad. I mean, it could start with just you went to that field,
Hmm.
you had some idea that there would be a good photograph there. You didn't necessarily know, okay, it was going to be this exact shot, but you had visualized it just to that extent, right?
Yeah.
Like, why were you there instead of someplace else? You put yourself there. Like, why was of I live on this coastline with all these different places I could have gone. Why did I go to this one spot? Well, I kind of gravitated to it, kind of a process of elimination. I knew I didn't know that I wanted to come away with a photograph of the wave. I had no idea of that until I got there, and I went, whoa. Then the visualization kicked in of that
Hmm.
particular image.
Mm.
But before that, it was kind of like, I want an interesting photograph of the sunset. I don't want it to just be another, okay, beautiful sunset. I wanted something unique about it. And that was the general idea. That's the general visualization. Then as I explored, like you said, and I just started going down this path, literally going down the path. And at each place I took a photograph. Then it wasn't until I got down to the bottom that I really noticed these waves. So it goes, it's like the general visualization, and sometimes you narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down, and all of a sudden it's like, there it is. There's the money shot. That's the image that I was looking for. And it is a process. It's not just a one-time deal. Here's a classic example. Ansel Adams, one of his most iconic photographs is the moon over Half Dome.
Oh, yes.
We've
Yes.
probably all seen that because it's one of his most famous photographs. So he was on his way. I've heard this story from both his son. I've heard Ansel telling it, and I've also heard his grandson tell me the story. But he was on his way to rehearsal. Every year they had this show. He was in Yosemite. He was on his way driving his Cadillac. cool old
It was a
Cadillac.
convertible, right? Was it?
He had no, I don't think he had a convertible. He had a
Mm.
Cadillac station wagon,
Mm. Oh,
which
cool.
is really unusual,
Yeah.
with a big roof rack on it that he put his cameras on. And then he had a Cadillac sedan. He was driving the sedan, and he had his Hasselblad in the car with him. And he looks over and he's driving along and he sees the moon over Half Dome. Boom, pulls over. But even there, he writes about how he visualized it. Where did he need to stand and what lens did he need to put on that camera to make it into the photograph that he ultimately ended up with?
Yeah.
So he very quickly visualized that, and then he went into action with that lens, with that camera, with the tripod where he wanted it, and that's how he captured it. But it can be very, very fast, you know, or it can be over a long period of time. Like I've gone back to the same location many times, just trying to come away with that one image that I really, really want. But Raymond, I believe this is the way it works. We need inspiration to fuel that visualization.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that comes from many forms of watching movies, listening to music, looking at art, you know, watching my YouTube channel.
Yeah. Shameless plug. Also,
Yeah.
will be in the show notes.
Yeah, exactly. Then you take that and you put it into action. Oh, and by the way, in addition to these phone calls and surveys that I was telling you about, I've been running a weekly critique show on my YouTube channel. I'm plugging it, but the point being, it gives me hands-on live experience, because it's a YouTube live where people are commenting, to look at images that work and ones that don't work.
Mm-hmm.
And listen, I'll call it out either way. I don't believe in sugarcoating, because if you just want to get a like or whatever, that tells you nothing.
Mm-hmm.
If you get intelligent feedback that's constructive, I don't tear people down, but I just say what it is. And I'll tell you in a minute what I found was the most common mistake that people were making with their composition, if you think that might be interesting.
Oh, 100%.
There's one mistake that I saw over and over again, but that gave me a whole other kind of layer of getting in touch with my audience, because I could see at once, this photograph really works, kabam, this one doesn't, and I'll tell you why it doesn't work. So since composition was, so I mentioned the biggest points of struggle were inspiration and composition. It might be interesting to find what I've seen as the biggest compositional stumbling.
Can I guess? Can I guess real quick?
Yeah, please.
Is it everything's in the center of the frame?
That's pretty close, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Everything there's no center of interest.
Mm-hmm.
So if I was talking to you, because photography is a communication means, and it's really important to remember it is a communication means, just like a verbal communication is. So if I said, Raymond, look over there. Hey, have a look over there. That's really cool. And you look over and you go, and I'm not gesturing to any one thing. I'm just saying, look over there. And you go, well, yeah, what? And I go, yeah, isn't that cool?
What are you talking about? Yeah.
And you go, what? What isn't what cool? Yeah, it's so cool. So that's kind of like what happens if you take a photograph and there's no center of interest.
Yeah.
I've got a picture of a tree, a dog, and a duck. And they're all kind of equally in the frame. Do I think the duck is the coolest thing, the dog, or the tree? You have no way of knowing, because they're all just
there,
framed equally the same.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But now if I take the tree, I use it as a frame against the dog, and I think the duck is the most interesting part of this photograph. I'll move in closer to the duck. The duck will be in focus. Maybe the dog and the tree are out of focus. Now, immediately you go, I know what he's talking about. He's talking about the duck. So that's the difference between me saying, wow, look over there, Raymond, isn't that cool? As opposed to saying, look at that duck. how cool is that duck against the tree and the dog? But I've made it very clear to you that I want you to look at the duck first.
Yeah.
And that's the secret sauce right there. If there's no center of interest, that's kind of number one. No
Hmm.
center of interest, I don't know what I'm supposed to look at. It's kind of confusing. Just like a sentence that says, look over there, but not look at that duck. Now, step two of that is you got to do something about that center of interest that's unique and that makes it a compelling image to look at. So maybe the duck just sitting there like this with its wings in isn't very interesting. But now the dog barks at the duck, and all of a sudden it's flapping its wings,
Hmm.
and we can see the dog in the background barking at it. That's a little story now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the difference between those is that the first photograph, you're just pressing the shutter and not thinking about, is there something that's going to be happening here that could be interesting?
Hmm.
Because a lot of photography boils down to being patient. You go to a location and you think there's something here, just like you out in that field. You don't know when you're pressing the shutter photograph number one, you don't know that 36 photographs later, you're going to get the
The money
photograph that
shot.
you want.
Of
Yeah,
course. Of
the money
course.
shot. So I'm sitting there, I go, well, there's some cool elements here. There's a dog, a duck, and a tree that none of them are doing anything really interesting yet. But if I just sit here and, I keep photographing and wait, maybe I'll get lucky and something will startle the duck and its wings will come out or the dog will bark at it or whatever. And bam, there it is.
Like
So that makes that
like they say, luck.
composition.
Sorry,
It's
go on.
well, it's luck, and it's luck, but also it's the famous quote. Louis Pasteur said, "Luck favors the prepared mind." Ansel Adams changed it. Luck favors the prepared photographer.
Yeah.
So if you're prepared, you've got the camera, you got the location, and you just wait. You could say it's lucky, but really you were prepared.
Of course, of course.
Yeah,
That's a huge thing because you can't just go out there with no knowledge of your camera and expect to get great photos. So you have to be prepared in your technical abilities to be able to do that. But then when it comes to inspiration and composition, these are things that also take time. I mean, you might get lucky without
yeah,
any sort of knowledge and get a photo with a good composition on accident, but you can really increase those odds by being more prepared and just shooting more and doing more of those things, right?
exactly.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
and sometimes it's going back to a location many, many times. It's a great location, but nothing has really happened yet.
yeah.
Keep going back there.
So then now let's assume, right? We were out there, we saw this beautiful tree, we saw this duck, we saw this dog, we waited for it. We took the photo. We get back home and we think to ourselves like, yeah, that's a good photo, but kind of what does it mean? Like what's the big picture? Like what are we as photographers? What did you learn from these photographers who you interviewed
Yeah.
about the photos that they wanted to take? What do they want to do with these photos? What do these
There you
photos
go.
mean to them?
That's the punchline, but let's jump right into it. That was the key thing that I found had in common with everybody I interviewed. So here it is, Raymond. They all wanted to get their work out to the world to leave something meaningful behind. And I think that our current, the pandemic has had a lot to do with that because I think we've all become aware of life isn't just the normal, going to go on just the way it always is.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have started looking at that in terms of what, yeah, if I am a photographer, what do I want out of all these photographs? So every one of them expressed to me in some way or another that they wanted to somehow get their work out to the world and ideally leave something behind. So that could be a book, that could be a zine, a small book.
Mm-hmm.
Could be an exhibit. Those are hard to do these days, again. So books were kind of high on the list. Uh, and that means you have to have sort of a body of work that fits together, which is another important thing.
Well, then let me ask you,
Yeah,
because I want to go back to that example of this dog duck in the tree, because
yeah,
I can see that photo in my head and I like the photo, right? I can see it in my
yeah.
head and I like it. But when it comes to creating work that we want to leave behind in some sort of meaningful sense, is this photo a waste of our time, for lack of a better term, I suppose?
Well, it has to fit into some context. So
Mm-hmm.
this could be a series. Like, this is one thing that's really important, is if you're thinking in terms of leaving something behind, a book, let's just say a book. And I'm, by the way, I'm actually going to be mentoring people on how to do this, because a lot of people, and I hear this over and over, oh, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book someday, or I'm going to publish a bunch of my photographs in a book someday. And someday. I mean, listen, I had it on my list for decades to publish my work before I actually wrote my first book. And now I've written one, it's very easy to keep writing more and publishing more, but that it takes some doing to figure out and to know how to do your first book. So I'm actually creating a class on how to do that. But if you're thinking in terms of leaving something behind, you probably have to think, not probably, you have to think in terms of a cohesive whole. How does this all fit together?
Mm-hmm.
What's the story? What's the overall story here? So maybe the dog, duck, and tree photograph could fit together because I'm going back to where my grandparents lived and photographing them in their environment. They have a little farm, let's say, and I'm taking a series of photographs about my grandparents. And this happens to be, even though they're not in the photograph, this happens to be on their farm, and there's a dog, duck, and a tree. And this is one of those photographs that fits in with all these other photographs. And now I put this book together. And by the way, when I talk about publishing books, I'm not just saying you've got to get out there and get a New York Times bestseller, or a big hit on Amazon. I'm talking about even making a book for your own family, like of your grandparents or your kids or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That's really important and really powerful. But if you're planning that as the end result, you just go backwards from that. So what am I going to put in this book about my grandparents to really convey to other people who will never meet them, or people that do know them, their kind of their character and what they really are about? So it isn't just a bunch of snapshots strung together. It's like a story about them. And that dog, duck, and tree, just it fits in.
It fits in. It always fits in.
By the way, when you're telling stories and you're putting a series of photographs together, there are those photographs that really stand out on their own, that are just like, wow. Then there's other photographs that we call transitional or linking photographs. By themselves are maybe not the big wow, but they tell part of the story, and they link the other images together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to know that you need both. So sometimes, you were saying a minute ago, talking about the boring photographs, sometimes those are boring on their own. They would be like, okay, great.
Yeah, cool. A duck. I get it. Cool.
I get it, duck, dog, whatever. But and they're not the showstopper, but they do serve a purpose because they link the story together. Maybe earlier we have a picture of grandma with the dog on the porch, So now we see this dog is really a part of their life. And that was a really cool photograph because she's talking to the dog or something, And that's like, whoa, that's a really cool photograph of grandma. And then later we see the dog by itself with the duck and the fence and the tree, and it links it together, and it has more purpose than just being a photograph all by itself.
As if that dog was part of the family. Suddenly, I can already see this book in my head, and it makes more sense.
I know. I think I should go out and photograph it.
Well, that actually brings me to my next question, which is, I like the idea of a book, and we're talking about photo books here. I like the
Yeah.
idea of a book. I like the idea of coming up with, having a story specifically for a book. These aren't just
Yeah.
snapshots. But I think one thing that I struggle with, perhaps, and maybe it's just because I'm second guessing myself, maybe it's coming up with a topic to shoot, or would you recommend just taking your body of work and creating a story out of the images that you already have?
You can do it both ways. I have done it both ways. I have a huge library, so it helps me to be able to dive in and
Yeah.
pull stuff out. But I think there's two ways you go about it. One is, yeah, accumulate just an enormous library and then pull photographs out of it. But I think a better way really is to decide on a project and then photograph it. And this is also really good discipline to learn photography. Because if we're just taking random photographs and they don't fit together, there's no real discipline to it.
Mm-hmm.
But if all of a sudden we say, okay, what story do I really want to tell with my camera? What is that story? And I think this is a really good exercise, again, in today's world, because let's face it, we're not going to be doing the traveling that we once were for a while.
Yeah.
And if we are, it's more difficult. But the stories are right in our own area, maybe even in our own house, but certainly in our own neighborhood, there's a story there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like any story, you just have to think of it in terms of a beginning, middle, and end. And if you start working towards that project, you'll accumulate a body of work. Take the grandparents. So I wish I had done this with my grandparents and I didn't. It's like, what is their life like?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you see them every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. You just start photographing them every time you see them. After a few months, you're going to have a lot of photographs you could turn into a book.
What about something that, like, maybe it doesn't have a specific start and an end? Like something that I've always seen in my head. I just love clouds. I think they're just so beautiful, and they're calming, and I enjoy looking at them and editing pictures of clouds. But like, these aren't photos that necessarily I share, but regardless, there's no really start and end to clouds. Right. So is there a way that I could develop that idea into a book?
Absolutely. So I talk about portraiture.
Mm-hmm.
And portraiture could be a portrait of not just a person. Obviously, we know we can take portraits of animals.
Yes.
I mean, I've had many animals pose for me. I'm not kidding. A horse. They know they're posing. I've had a deer pose for me. Several deers pose for me. I've had dogs pose for me.
Any penguins?
But we also, what's that?
Any penguins?
I have penguins. Yes, I have. Yeah.
I got to see that photo.
I will send that over to you. This penguin wasn't actually posing; they were walking, so I can't say they were posing. But we can also take portraiture in the bigger sense of taking a portrait of a tree.
Mm-hmm.
Camille Seaman is somebody I interviewed. We were talking about her earlier. She's a Native American, and she said, in my culture, we believe everything is alive. She takes portraits of icebergs.
Oh, wow.
And then we tend to think inanimate objects are not alive and that's not a portrait, but she considers it a portrait.
Mm-hmm.
A cloud, you could consider that I'm going to take a series of cloud portraits because they all have their own unique look and portrait,
mm-hmm.
And personality. So in that case, the thing that ties it together, even though it doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end, is that these are portraits of clouds.
Mm-hmm.
That would be, the other way you could tell a story.
So I got to add emotion in there. It's gonna be full of emotion. So that means lots of drama. I'm thinking of beautiful colors in the sky.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's lots of things, and I like that idea. And now I'm going to pursue it. So thank you so much for helping me out with that.
It'll be your, hey, listen, I'll be happy to write your your forward to it.
Oh, perfect. I was there
I'll,
when
I'll
Raymond had this idea.
I'll say I was on the show and gave you the idea of cloud portraits. But think about that. There's many different portraits that we can
Yeah.
take, and um, there's photographers who made their whole career out of portraiture. Annie Leibovitz, Richard Avedon. Richard Avedon took his camera to the Southwest, and just set it up
Hmm.
and took pictures of people he found along the way with a white backdrop. And it's this incredible series of photographs. There's no beginning, middle, and end to it. It's just, these are portraits of people from the West, and that makes a great book. That makes a compelling book. So there's the story aspect, and then there's the subject matter,
Hmm.
the uniform subject matter. And in the case of clouds or trees or dogs and ducks and trees, maybe that's your series.
That's funny. Well, I'm thinking about these ideas, and obviously the clouds we got there. We got
Yeah.
Avedon with his with the white backdrops, and I can see the photos in my head. Like you still see landscape, but it's these people who are in front of these white backdrops. And
Yeah.
these photos that I'm thinking of are definitely more on the artistic side, and we're not talking about anything about gear or anything to that sense.
Yeah.
When you were interviewing photographers, when you're really trying to learn what their biggest struggles are, you had mentioned earlier, about the art of photography and not just talking
Yeah.
about the gear. Can we explore that a little bit more? What do we
Sure.
mean by that? What's the struggle there?
Well, okay, so gear fits into, there's the 5 stages of photography, remember? So there's visualization, but you do have to know your equipment,
Hmm.
because you can have a great idea, but if you don't know your camera, you're not going to get it.
Of course.
And the one of the photographers I've interviewed a lot, Bob Holmes, excuse me, National Geographic photographer,
Hmm.
fantastic photographer. He said you have to know your camera to know what it sees. How does your camera see? Because your camera sees differently than your eye. And if you don't know how your camera sees, you're going to be really disappointed.
Hmm.
Case in point, how many times have you seen a sunset? You pull out your iPhone and you go, wow, that's going to be incredible. Press the shutter and it looks like nothing.
Yeah, every time, just about.
Every time. iPhones are terrible at capturing sunsets. They just, the reason is you have to be able to stop your lens way down,
Hmm.
like f16, f22, something like that, to get a good sunset shot. Otherwise, it's going to be all pixelated and it just doesn't look like anything.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's knowing your gear. So I'm never going to take a really satisfying photograph of a sunset with this camera. But you have to know what your equipment is capable of doing and how it's going to look. And that just comes from experience and testing it out. But you also have to be familiar with it so that when you are in that moment where there is just a split second to capture that photograph, you're not fumbling with the camera.
Yeah.
You're not going, let's see. Why is this autofocus throwing me off? I had this happen just the other day. The autofocus wouldn't autofocus. Have you ever had that happen?
In fact, just over the weekend, yeah. So that's funny that you say that. Yeah, it's
It's
frustrating, isn't it?
it keeps going like this.
Hmm.
And you can't press the shutter. It will not allow you to take the picture. And it's literally blocking you, stopping you from getting the photograph. So you have to know, kick it into manual. Forget about the autofocus
Hmm.
and focus it manually. You had that experience. I had that experience over the weekend when I was photographing these waves. Because it was just it didn't know whether it wanted me to focus on the clouds, or even though I had a very specific spot for it,
Yeah.
it just wouldn't accept my focus.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's something you have to know your gear. Otherwise, you're going to just say, I can't take this picture. The camera won't let me take the picture. So you have to know, okay, go into manual, focus it manually, bypass this stupid system right now that
Yeah.
doesn't understand what's going on, right?
So then we talked there obviously about the gear side.
Yeah.
We kind of understand that. if we understand the gear, because okay, let me start over. As a beginner, that's pretty much the thing that we have to go on to grow, right? Because
Yeah,
we need to learn and understand the gear, and then at some
yeah,
point we become competent enough that we have this visualization and we see these photos in our head that we want to take. But how can we dive deeper into the artistic realm of photography?
yeah. There's a couple of key things. One is, and this is an exercise I do in my workshops, and I recommend it. It's in my book, Advancing Your Photography. Look for photographs with, and forget about the gear. Look for photographs. You can do it like this, you know,
Like the old
you,
director's eye right there with
the
the
old
fingers.
director's thing. You
Uh-huh.
can do it. This is my preferred frame, but create a frame, right? And so you have to learn to think in terms of the frame of your camera. And this is another stumbling block for a lot of beginners. They're kind of looking at everything as, and like right there, it's again, it's a little bit like, hey, look over there,
Yeah.
you know, instead of look right there, point. So train your eye to see in terms of the frame of your camera. And you can do that anytime, anywhere. And it's an exercise, just like, learning to sing is an exercise. You don't necessarily know how to use these vocal cords until you practice with them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is training your eye where you want to learn to see photographs. And this has nothing to do with your gear. This is just purely artistic. And then another way of doing that is when you look at other people's work, look at photographs or paintings for that matter, look at how that artist used their frame. And you can see what they, sometimes you have I'll tell you a great book to check out, but sometimes if you're lucky, you can see other frames and know why that one really worked.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really cool book. It's, and the title of it is escaping me right now, but it's Magnum Photographs. I don't know if you've seen it, but it shows the contact sheets of these photographs.
Oh yeah, no, I think it's just called contact sheets.
Contact sheets, thank
Mm-hmm.
you.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who don't know what a contact sheet, this is when you have a negative and you lay it on a strip of photographic paper and you lay all your negatives out and you just get a print of that, not enlarged at all. And in the days gone by, and we do that like in Lightroom, when you open it up in your grid,
Mm-hmm.
you see all those smaller images. That's like a contact sheet. But what's interesting when you look at that is you can see the sequence, of the photographs that didn't work, and all of a sudden, wow, there's the money shot.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can see the process they were going through until they got to that money shot. So it's knowing what to include in the frame, what not to include in the frame. And as a rule, less is more.
See, this is where it gets difficult because oftentimes, and maybe you struggle with this as well, as an educator of sorts.
Yeah.
Not that I have any sort of training or anything to be any sort of educator, but I know through experience how I got here and how I create the photos that I make and how
Yeah.
I can do something more artistic and whatnot. And then, if somebody new comes along and they really want help to be able to create, that beautiful shot, as the professional, you can see how many steps they have to go through to be able to get that. Well, there needs to be visualization. I
Yeah.
can see the depth of field there, so you're going to need like a specialty lens.
Yeah.
There's might be even flash involved there. And the answer to them has to be, well, you need more experience.
True.
And that's where it gets real frustrating because I want to help them out more and I want to give them answers. Like, this is how we do this. This
Yeah.
is how I can educate you. But I can only tell you the answer. You can't understand it until you actually go out and do it yourself.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why, we're kind of moving into to number 5 here, which is
It
the
is.
idea of a mentor, to have somebody
Yeah.
to help you get to where it is that you want to go. So you want to talk to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So that was the other thing I did find is that almost one for one, again, even with pros, because a lot of pros have a project in mind that they know it's a challenge and they haven't actually made it yet.
Mm-hmm.
So they know they need to be pushed out of their comfort zone too, right? And they need a mentor to help them. So I've spent the last 10 years figuring this out. And that is basically, how do we create, what's an ideal educational mode or platform for photography? We were talking about this a little bit. I went to art school for exactly 1 year. Didn't get very much out of it. In fact, I was a better photographer when I came into the school than when I left.
Oh no.
I was. And there were many reasons why it failed. I'm not going to go into great depth, but the main thing is you have to create a program that has an educational foundation to it. So it isn't just a bunch of opinions that I'm throwing at students. Like, I don't like your photograph because it's my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be some basis for that. Like what I said earlier, no, lacking a center of interest, that's not really an opinion. That's, you can observe that. You can look through photographs and you can go, this one captures my attention, this one doesn't. Why? Because this one has a center of attention, this one doesn't. That's like an observable thing. Just like saying, hey, look over there.
Yeah.
So there has to be curriculum or material that actually teaches people stuff that works. But then there has to be what a mentor does is really is a shortcut. Because if I've already taken all these steps and it took me 10 years, I don't want other people to have to take 10 years and do all the research themselves. So I can give them shortcuts. And there are a couple of ways to shortcut this thing. One is to give them exercises to do that actually are guaranteed to raise their awareness as a photographer. And I gave you one of them already, doing this.
Yes, with the director's eye.
Yeah. So really consciously do that, and train your eye, train your eye, train your eye, train your eye. Another one is to pick a project, and we kind of touched upon this as well. Pick a project, and week after week, because a mentorship, I believe, needs to be at least once a week.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to learn anything if it's too spread out. And the problem with, just as much as I love YouTube and it's a great platform, there's no discipline to it. I mean, I could be on this video, that video, I'm bouncing all over the place, and it's not following a logical course.
Right, right.
And that can actually get confusing, right? One day you're looking at a video about shooting landscapes, another one is like certain lenses that you should use, and then you're bouncing
an
from
unboxing video and
an unboxing. Well, so what does that teach you? Nothing, right?
Nothing.
I don't even get how unboxing videos work, because if you're going to talk intelligently about the camera, you have to have used it, right?
In theory, yeah.
I have done one where I cheated, where I just used it and then I put it back in the box and then I opened the box. But there's not a lot of education going on there. But anyway, a project is really important because you are following a course of action.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're coming back every week, and I'm looking at your photographs week to week, we're not just commenting on one photograph here, one photograph there, but we're seeing your progress that you're making or not. Just like if you're going to learn piano and you have a weekly piano lesson, even if it's a group lesson, you're coming back every week. You should have been playing the piano in between, right?
Yeah.
And this is true in sports. I mean, I trained as a swimmer and I had a weekly coaching session. Well, if I just didn't swim in between, I would have made no progress.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But obviously I was practicing everything in between and coming back, and the coach could see what's the next thing I need to address with him. So that's how mentorship works. What I do also is have everybody pick their own project. I'm not going to assign a project for them, and everybody's going to pick a different project. Mm-hmm. It really should come from your heart. Like, what is it I am passionate about that's going to cause me to want to take photographs? week after week after week after week, day after day, get up in the morning when it's
Yeah,
cold
cold,
and dark and
snowy.
stay up late at night. Something has to drive you to do that. And if it's not money, if you're not getting paid to go out and do it, which isn't a very good motivator anyway,
Hmm.
uh, then there should be some passion behind it. And the passion only comes from you. I can't I can't tell you what you should be passionate about. Everybody knows. I think they have a pretty good idea. Like, I really do want to tell this story. Like, you pick clouds. I mean, that's
Hmm.
something you're passionate about.
Well, okay. Let me ask you another question here because growing up, I always had this idea. The thing that I wanted to do most, and I've said this on the podcast before, was, photograph the band on like their start to getting a Grammy, right? When they
Yeah.
started recording the
Oh, that'd be
album,
cool.
they got the Grammy. Or
Yeah.
the winning sports team, right? Spring training all the way to winning the World Series, which past guest John Suhu photographed the Dodgers. So fantastic year for him. Very excited. But like those are the
Yeah.
things that I get excited about, are these really long term projects. So while
Yeah.
I see things like clouds, I love this. Like I just want to photograph more of those. I think deeper down, there's still that urge to do that big long term project.
Yeah.
Uh, can these two things be done at the same time, or what sorts of tips do you have
Yeah.
for doing capturing two things that you are equally passionate about?
Yes. I think you break it down into sub projects, So in other words, rather than, and I wouldn't urge a newer photographer to take on that multi-year, project.
Huge
Like,
project, yeah.
yeah, from entry to Grammy, who knows how long that's going to take, right?
Right, right, right.
So that could throw you off because it's just such a long period of time unknown. I would break it into like chapters in a book. So maybe you do think in terms of like this long term thing, but maybe your first chapter is the beginnings of this band. The first 3 months of them getting together and even meeting each other and getting to know each other, and that could be really interesting.
Hmm.
And then they finally find their vibe, let's say together, and all of a sudden there's this like magical moment where you can see it in their faces. They're looking at each other. They're not just playing by themselves, because that's something that happens in music, right? Is you're interacting with the other band members. You're not just sort of off in your own little world here.
Yes.
There's And you can see that all of a sudden, like at first maybe they're all just kind of in their own little shell, and then they find their kind of musical vibe. And I'm just going on about this thing,
No,
but
this is great. I love this. Yeah.
this is a sub project, and that could be a really interesting project in itself, and you could do that over a few months.
Hmm.
I like to think of projects in terms of 3 months. Somehow it's kind of a bite-sized piece of time, that a year is a long time.
It
When
is, yeah.
you know, we know how long this year has been. It's
10 years.
unbelievably
Yeah.
long. It's the longest year I've ever gone through. Writing a book is basically a 1 year project, because not only do you have to write it, in my case, I illustrate it with my photographs, and that's a whole process. Then there's the endless editing and proof checking and that and beta testing and all this other stuff that I do with my books, you know. And then once the book is published, guess what? They don't just fly off the shelves by themselves.
Right.
You have to get out there and promote them, and that's a whole other thing. So it's at least a 1 year project, and that's a big commitment. So why don't we just say 3 months? I mean, a week isn't, obviously, a month isn't really long enough. 2 months, somehow 3 months is about right.
Hmm.
So you say, I'm going to photograph this particular whatever over this 3 month period, and at the end of that, I'm going to sift it down into my 10 best photographs, let's say. That's the chapter of this book.
Wow. So
And
then
then
the next 3 months would be possibly the next chapter,
the next chapter,
and then let
exactly.
it grow on its own.
Let it grow on its own.
But
Exactly.
like a good book, every chapter should be able to stand on its own as well. So
Yeah.
that's why I like that exercise. I like that exercise because it does.
Yeah.
It breaks it down into much more bite-sized chunks, and it seems like I can do anything for 3 months. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? And if I get a few good photos, then awesome. And if it doesn't go any further than that, well, then I got a few good photos, and you should be happy about that. But
exactly. In my mentorship program, I'm taking that 3 month period
mhm.
with the group, and then we're going to publish a book of a selection of everybody's photographs over that 3 month period.
Oh wow.
So they will be published at the end of this
Hmm.
as part of the group, but they will be published. So let's say there's 5 from each person in the group. Those 5 best photographs will be included in the book.
Hmm.
It's an end result. There's something really satisfying about a book as you pick it up, you hold it in your hand, it's physical, you give it to somebody, they pick it up. It's very different than what we do with computer images where they're just
Yeah.
pixels.
Even as I was saying earlier, actually I don't think I said this earlier. I was thinking it earlier in my head.
Yeah.
I make a family yearbook every year, and
Oh
basically
yeah.
these are just snapshots that I took on my cell phone. And even though none of those photos are really good, in a technical sense or anything, just holding it in your hand, as you said, is an entirely different experience. And I
Yeah.
could say that, and people could listen and say, "Yeah, okay, I get it," but you really don't get it until you
You
actually
don't.
hold it in your hand. Yeah.
My
Well,
wife is my wife is on that note, my wife has made books for each of our kids, and she makes 2 copies. We keep one and we give one to them.
uh-huh.
And it's really amazing. It's really cool. And like you said, these are snapshots of them
Yeah.
growing up, but it has a special place. It has it's a whole story just about them.
Of course, and who wouldn't want to see that? Now, this is another side thing. My kids are getting older. And I say that as my
Older
daughter's
meaning what?
4, my daughter's 4, and my son
Okay,
will be
yeah.
8 on Saturday. But I have a little Google Home right here next to my computer, and it just goes through photos that I've taken, and I
Yeah.
look at some of them and think, how have we already gone this far? Like, I cannot believe that this has already been, 6 years,
I
even two
know.
years, or even just a year. Like, I can't believe we've gone so far just in this amount of time. That, yeah, having that book, I would imagine would be worth all of the money in the world when you get
Oh,
to a
it's
certain point.
fantastic. It's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Well, Mark, you have been so gracious with your time. We've been on here for almost an hour and a half, which is
Wow.
absolutely crazy. But I've really enjoyed myself. I want to say thank you, obviously, for coming on. But before I let you go, can you share with the listeners where they can find out more about you and follow you online, and even your mentorship?
Absolutely. Well, so here's the first thing I would encourage you to do. Get a hold of my book, Advancing Your Photography. And I actually have a special on it right now. For the ebook, you can get it at half price, $4.95. I'm practically giving it away.
Yeah.
And I have a specific place you go for that. It's basically the URL is advancingyourphotography.com. Advancingyourphotography.com. It'll take you right to that book. Boom, you can get it right there and you'll have an instant download. My YouTube channel, where I do my critiques every week, I do a critique show every Thursday. And the way to find that is just go by my name, Marc Silber. It's also called Advancing Your Photography. So either way, you can get there on YouTube. Um, those will lead you to my mentorship program because I'm talking about it a lot on both of them. So either one of those places, all roads kind of lead to the mentorship, because to me, this is the most important thing that I'm creating right now,
Hmm.
is an educational platform that leads to that mentorship. So if you go to either my YouTube or advancingyourphotography.com, you'll find me. I also have a website that you can go to, which is silberstudios.com.
So
So
I will go ahead and link to obviously all of those things in the show notes. If somebody's driving and they don't have a post-it note or anything nearby,
yeah,
that they can go ahead and find that. But again, Mark, thank you so much for coming on. Truly appreciate your time and your experience.
thank you, Raymond. My pleasure always being back with you, and we'll do it again, I'm sure.
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. There's a lot of things to love about Mark, but one thing is that, with the amount of experience that he has and knowledge about photography, I feel like he's the perfect person to be able to correlate a story with how it pertains to how you can become a better photographer. And he's just full of them. So full of them. So much fun. My biggest takeaway from this episode was just how easily Marc broke down what goes into a good photograph, right? The three elements of every good photo. It needs timing, it needs light, and it needs composition. So, next time you're out and you're shooting and you're feeling maybe a little bit overwhelmed and the scene just isn't working, the answer is going to be one of those three reasons is going to be why. Either the timing is wrong, the light is wrong, or the composition is wrong, right? And if you can fix that one thing, then you'll be good. Now, we as photographers need to discover what that is, right? You don't know sometimes by just looking at a photo if you're there trying to get it to work, if it's, well, is it problem light? Is it, I don't know what these things are. But as you continue to, practice, as you continue to put in the work, you're going to be able to learn those things. And I know today I can look back at some of my old photographs and instantly recognize, oh, this is what it needs to be a better photo. And my hope, and again, that just comes with time and practice. And I'm not saying that I'm the best photographer in the world, because I'm not. And my hope is genuinely that in 5 or 6 years from now, I'm going to be able to grow enough to be able to look at the images that I'm taking today and once again, instantly be able to recognize what they need to be better photographs. It's an ever-evolving progression. It is forever evolving. So, remember that next time you're out and you're shooting and, maybe you're feeling a little bit frustrated. This takes time. You're going to have, some bad shots. You're going to have things that just don't feel like they're working. But overall, what you're feeling right now, you're going to grow from it. So, well, thank you so much for joining me today on this first interview of the year. I hope to see you in the Facebook group sometime soon. Again, we are doing the Photo Minute Mondays. So every Monday I'm sharing a new video with a tip or a trick about photography to help you, deepen your understanding of how to use your camera. So that is it for this week. Again, hope to see you next week. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Beginner Photography Podcast. If you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review in iTunes. Keep shooting, and we'll see you next week.